What is contrast and saturation, and how do you apply it to your work? I'm going to be talking about those concepts using examples in Photoshop, showing you how to adjust certain settings to manipulate these two things. So let's talk about it. So let's define the terms first, and I'll start with contrast. Contrast basically just means something that's different or opposite. Now, opposites attract in artwork. So the more things you have in your artwork that are different from each other, the more striking and arguably appealing it will look. Another easy way to think about it is that contrast is the difference between the darkest darks and the lightest lights. So let's use an example in Photoshop. But before I start, please hit that subscribe button. It all helps. So thanks. So I've got this picture of Blackbeard here, and if I go up to image in the top here and go down to adjustments, I can hit this little dialog box, brightness and contrast. And this comes up, and you've got brightness here and you've got contrast here. Now you can slide contrast box this way, you can slide this way, and you'll notice that the image becomes sharper with more contrast and becomes less sharp with less contrast. And that's because as the contrast is lowered, it's bringing all of these tones and bringing them closer together in value. So like these mid-tones and these light tones and these dark tones are all going towards this middle section here, this middle grey. And as you bump up the contrast, they're going further away. So the really dark tones go down and the light tones go up. Now, full disclosure, I don't think I've ever used this dialog box because it's not versatile enough for me. Like, it's just one slider and it's either more or less. So I don't use that, but it's good to know that it's there. Instead, if you go into image adjustments and then one lower and you hit levels, you bring up this dialog box. And you know this one's serious because there's not one, but there's 3 sliders. Now make sure you've got this little preview box ticked, because then as you're adjusting these, you can see it in real time in your artwork, which is helpful. So if we take this image I did of Aerith, even though I called it Eris, never mind, and I'm going to levels, you'll see this lovely little graph. So these sliders represent your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. Now, if you start with highlights and work backwards, if you take this slider and you move it towards the darks, basically wherever you move the slider, in whatever direction, the opposite happens to your artwork. So if you take the highlight slider and move it towards the dark sliders, everything gets light. If you take the midtones and you bring it towards the light, everything gets dark. And likewise, if you bring the midtones to the dark, the midtones get lighter as well. You see this looks quite washed out at the moment. And if you take the darks and move it towards the light, the shadows get darker as well. I'm going to hit OK and then switch between before and after. So this is after and that was before. So you see that how the contrast has affected this, how like this gradient has been washed out and all of these lights have been pushed towards the white. So this is all basically pure white now. And like these were dark and quite muted, whereas now they're really saturated. But personally, I think that's a bit too extreme. I mean, it's interesting, I'll give it that, but I think that's a bit too extreme. Now, if this is quite confusing to you, and it probably will be at first, Photoshop has an auto button. If you're not sure what to do, just click this button here, and Photoshop thinks this is perfect, so it hasn't actually changed anything. But let's just say that a lot of people's work is quite washed out. Let me just do that, and then I'll go back to levels, hit auto. You notice that it changed. Granted, not much. With these adjustment levels, really, it's all about sort of experimenting and just moving them about until it does something that you quite like. And really, it's down to personal taste. But again, that auto button will help a lot. Now, those two examples are for finished artworks and you sort of adjusting the finishing touches, really, and just seeing how the overall thing works. But if you don't do digital art at all and you just do pencil work, this can be really helpful as well for either scanned images, or if you've taken a photo of your image and you've uploaded it and maybe you want to ink over it or you want to color it in or what have you. You can open up your adjustment levels here and notice because there's not a huge variation in tone, that's why the graph looks like this. Again, you can hit auto if you want and it will just shift things along a little bit and balance it out some more. However, if you want to let's say you want to get rid of the tone of the paper, which is sort of this light grey, you can take the white slider and bring it over, and you'll notice that these greys now are white. And then you can really punch up some of the darks just by, again, messing with the sliders, moving them around. And then you'll see with this adjustment layer, you've gone from this, which is quite washed out, to this, where you've increased the contrast. So now these outer contour lines look really, really dark in comparison to before. So yeah, so that's contrast in its basic form. And adjustment layers, I recommend you getting used to using adjustment layers as much as possible, because they're really, really versatile and very, very helpful. And it's one of those things that the more you do it, the easier you'll find it, and you'll get a feel for what you like and how you want to manipulate your stuff. So yes, contrast is difference. Lights, lights, dark, dark. So that was contrast. Now saturation. So saturation just means how much color there is, or how little color there is. Okay, so if I, for example, take a red, whack a red down, that's really, really red. And then I'll put another red in and I'll apply some grey to it. That's less red. So out of these two, the top one here, this one is more saturated because there's more red in it. And this one is less saturated because it's got less red in it. And it'll be exactly the same. The color doesn't matter, it's just like that's more saturated blue. And that's a less saturated blue. So remember, saturation is not the same as value. Value is how light or dark something is. Saturation is how much color there is. So how vibrant it is, or how muted it is. So as I mentioned in my video on line weights, which you should definitely go and watch, I mentioned Marco Bucci, and he talks about colors communicating. Specifically, it's the grays that communicate with the vibrant or saturated colors. So check out my video and then check out the link in that video, and then come back to this video and then do all that again and again and again and again and again and again. I'm getting off topic. Back to Photoshop. So if we take this painting of the dead man, what you can do is you can press Ctrl and U, or Command and U, and you bring up this hue or saturation box. Now hue just means color, so you can mess around with the colors, like the saturation and the values, they stay the same, it's just the colors that change. However, if you were to get the second slider down and reduce the saturation, you should start to see that it starts to turn black and white. This Photoshop is taking all the colors out, apart from the background. Ignore the background. Whereas if I bring that back into the middle and then start pushing it the other way, you'll notice that like the orangey tones become more orange, browny tones become more brown, bluey tones become more blue. It looks really loud and not very nice. But again, maybe you're looking at something like this and think, oh, that looks a bit too dark, a bit lifeless. Then you can still make small adjustments similar to the adjustment layers before. And then lightness just, makes it light or makes it dark. I don't tend to mess with that too much. You can do more to the lightness with adjustment layers. And let's say I wanted him to look ill. I mean, he's a dead man, I suppose. Then I suppose purple would make sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, maybe he's in his purple lighting. And that's how you can deal with saturation with Photoshop. There's not that much else to say about saturation compared to contrast. I think contrast is the one, if you're going to pick one of them to really focus on, then choose contrast every time, because that has more impact on your artwork. So just to recap, contrast means difference or opposites, so light versus dark. Saturation means more color or less color. And that is it in a nutshell. So now you know what those two terms mean. You can talk about art to artists all the time like a snob, and everyone will hate you for it. You're welcome. But are there any other terms that you've heard of, or you've heard other people use and you just don't know what they are, and maybe you feel embarrassed to ask? One, don't feel embarrassed, because we all have to learn. And even if you do know what they mean, maybe you don't know how to apply those things in Photoshop. Any of those are true, then let me know in the comments below and I'll make a video about it. Anyway, I've been Brinkley, have fun drawing, and I'll see you in the next video.